pre-lockdown and pre-restrictions, and we undenied for a while as to what to do and whether we could make this work. Whether we could make this work digitally. Having watched a few other organisations move their training onto digital platforms and their discussions into this type of format, we thought we'd give this a go. So we've got the first in series at the moment. We've got 3 booked. Hang on. These are the, sorry, very quickly, these are the people involved. We have, today you're being hosted by Creating Excellence, which is your design resource in the Southwest, who run the Design Southwest Design Review panel. We also have funding from MHCLG. So part of our program was to take the MHCLG design guide, the National Design Guide, and promote it. We're having to do that online for obvious reasons, but I think that opens up some new and interesting opportunities. But it also puts an interesting framework into which we can start discussing the topics contained within the design guide. So you're here today at webinar 1. We've got 2 more absolutely confirmed. There is a 4th that we're trying to put together as well. We're hoping that every Tuesday, 11 till 12, you're just going to set aside whatever you're doing and come along, because it's going to be loads of fun, and it's almost like not being on your own at home alone. So, you know, hopefully worth doing. Very quickly before I introduce the panel, I'm just going to run through, I'm sure you've all read the National Design Guide cover to cover and know every word, but for those who perhaps haven't, this is the document that we are talking about. This isn't training on the design guide. This is discussion and reflection on what it says, rather than attempting to do a training session on how to use it, etc. It's an interesting document, actually. It moves away from telling you what to do and moves much more towards the idea of explaining what a successful outcome looks like. So its structure is different to design guides that I've been involved in or used in the past. It has overarching themes. We're talking about climate today, but we have character and community. So the idea and the way the graphics work even try to get you to think, instead of traditional design guides, which are siloed and where you have kind of the different kind of topics living in their own chapters. This is trying to make everything interlink, and we can discuss how successfully that's done. So we've got 3 overarching themes. And then within it are the 10 characteristics of a well-designed place. And anyone who's read the document will see that rather than the how-to type guides that we're probably more used to either working with or producing, this is much more to do with you'll know what a successful place looks like because it will have these attributes or characteristics. So that's the kind of quick overview. Let me stop sharing this screen for a sec. Panel, I'd like you to introduce yourselves. I can't say go around the room because we don't have a room, but maybe if someone wants to jump in and just introduce yourself quickly to the audience. Go on, Doug, you go first.
Okay. Hello, I'm Doug King. I'm a physicist and an engineer, and I practice I'm in private practice, and I practice in the design of low energy and resource efficient buildings and urban environments. Whilst I'm mainly interested in the design of buildings and urban places, actually, although that's my work, what I'm really interested in is the social economics around energy and resources, and how, when we create systems and when we create policies, we sometimes create incentives for people to behave in different ways. Often those incentives are intended, but very often the incentives are unpredicted, unintended, and perhaps even perverse, and therefore lead to unexpected and unpredictable behaviours in terms of resource use. And it's those kind of interactions between people and social economics and the built environment that I'm interested in.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Who would like to go next?
Shall I go?
Yeah, go on.
Go on. So my name is Peter Clegg. I'm a founding partner of a practice called Field and Clegg Bradley Studios. I've been working in what I loosely term low energy design for 45 years or so. But actually the whole world has changed in the last 2 years. It's very interesting, really. I mean, since Greta Thunberg and since climate awareness and since the IPCC reports, etc. And also, considering that we actually now do produce buildings that are quite well insulated and use a lot less energy than they used to. The interesting thing for me that's changed, it's what we build our buildings of rather than how we use energy in them. So, I mean, that's a very detailed issue around the more general aspects that we're here to discuss, but I'm happy to elaborate on that a bit and to think along with the rest of you about you know, how on earth we're going to meet our climate change commitment targets.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. Finally, go on.
Hi, my name is Sarah Jones Morris. I'm a landscape architect and urban designer. I'm also the chair of the Landscape Institute Southwest. And I'm also the co-founder of the Association of Collaborative Design. I'm UK ambassador for Hush City, which is an open citizen science research project on noise pollution, of which anyone can get involved in. And I'm also building with nature assessor, which we might talk briefly about it, but I'm recently become fellow of the Landscape Institute, and my focus a lot of the time, as my business is the director of Landsmith Associates based in Bristol. As a landscape architect and urban designer, I'm very interested about health, equality, also diversity, and also about how we embed that within not just planning, but within all the way through process of design.
Oh, okay. Fantastic, thank you. I should introduce myself really. I'm Gary Hall, I'm an urban designer. I tend to get involved in very large kind of SUE style developments with a particular interest in movement modeling and understanding how sustainability and movement frameworks can work together. And I guess over kind of the last few years, that's evolved to include interconnected natural systems as well, although I wouldn't be claiming to be an expert on how they work in detail, but the idea of how they link together is something that I'm interested in. During the course of this discussion, the panel, that you're aware of this, but just to the audience, we will be having a series of questions that have been put to us in advance. Those are to help prompt the discussion that we're going to be having. So they'll pop up periodically, and we'll refer to those. You also have a chat window, I believe. If that's working, you'll be able to upvote and downvote questions, that kind of thing. So we really don't want you just to sit there and not feel involved and not be involved, albeit given the limitations of this format. To get the discussion going, rather than just dive into the design guide itself, I thought it would be quite interesting to, if anyone wants to, I don't know who wants to kick off with this, but discuss how the National Design Guide came about in the first place. What was the background to why it was needed, and what kinds of discussions were going on that may have shaped its formulation? I don't know who wants to lead on that one. I'm looking at you, Sarah, thinking you might.
I just think, well, obviously its background is the MPPF and it's come from it, and there's been various design guides. I mean, I think one of the first ones I remember is the Design Compendium, and there's been sequences, design guides over the time, and so this is yet another one. But I think what's interesting about this one is that it started at a time where there's been a rapid acceleration, and we're getting even more acceleration now, particularly with the current scenario of COVID-19. And so things like declarations of climate and biodiversity emergency, and just to reaffirm that when I talk about climate change, we're talking about climate emergency and biodiversity emergency. And so I think that's suddenly having to catch up very quickly. So yeah, that's where I think it's quite an interesting, but in terms of an obstacle, which I think to the panel here, I'd be interested to see what comes out.
Oh yeah, we've got our first poll, haven't we? Yeah. We had a pre-meeting to this, and in that you discussed the kind of chronology, and people were talking about where different kind of global events sat in relation to the production of this document. Has anyone got any kind of things they want to explain to people about that? I must admit, this is something I'm not aware of. I've got no feel for how this was kind of the gestation period within MHCLG, or even when these ideas started kicking around. Obviously, the guide was launched in October of last year, and you know, it's an unrecognizable world in which we live at the moment, for certainly in practice terms. So it'd be interesting to know what kind of thinking was feeding in, do we think?
Is that directed to me or is it?
Well, you know, you go ahead if you feel.
I just think that so Bristol City Council was one of the first. I think it was the first local authority to declare a climate emergency, and very recently now a biodiversity emergency. So on the local authority, it's been interesting. It's been more of a local and regional response rather than national government. So there's been a bit of a interesting ripple effect that's having. And that was happening during the time of this design guide evolving. So yeah, but the background of the climate change act was just the first one, I think, in the world, I might be wrong, but in 2008 was in the UK, but I think a lot of people felt, and it's very true, that not much has really been taken forward since then. And now there's some quite big changes, but how that filtered through is yet to be seen.
Okay.
I mean, I agree. I think this is a really difficult design guide when it comes to promote. It's very difficult for us to support it when it comes to promoting issues around climate change. Because I think it's kind of it's dropped out the bottom in a way. I think what's happened, my guess is that someone has written a really good sort of general design guide that looks at you know, all the issues of character and built form and movement patterns, etc., etc. And it feels as though someone else has come along and said, "Ah, yeah, but we've forgotten the elephant in the room. You know, we've forgotten. We've all signed up to IPCC reports about, you know, zero carbon, and we've forgotten the biodiversity crisis. We've forgotten those crises, and we've just put little notes at the end, or we've edited it and put a few things back in." And I worry that this document is not going to contribute. It doesn't take things seriously enough. And since it was produced, well, it was tail end of last year, I suppose, wasn't it? But actually, there were documents that I refer to on a regular basis that are a lot more useful and pointed in terms of the way they address issues of climate change, issues of biodiversity in the planning system and in architecture and urban design. And so I wouldn't really, if someone said, what do I have to do in order to meet the climate crisis as an architect and urban designer? I'm afraid I wouldn't say, go straight to this book, it'll tell you everything.
Yeah, I can't speak to how this document came about or has been produced, but surely it provides some useful signposting. One of my concerns is that actually, as an industry, design or construction, we tend to respond in a big way to whatever's the big political issue of the moment, whether that's the month or the decade. And we have a habit, I think, of pursuing single issue agendas in design and construction. And this is not necessarily intentional. It's just that we devote so much time and focus to addressing the big, hairy, audacious problem of the moment that we lose sight of some of the other issues. We don't necessarily always achieve an appropriate balance when we're thinking about climate change versus nature and ecology against urban design and design for young families and enabling entrepreneurship. If we focus too much in certain areas, we do lose sight of the bigger picture. So whilst this guide is not very good at giving us in-depth and answers, surely it's useful in terms of signposting the range of issues that we should be considering.
Yeah, and I sorry, go on, Peter. I was good.
Well, no, I was just going to say, yes, I agree to a certain extent, Doug. I just feel that one of the most significant signposts isn't really there right at the top. I mean, okay, so there is, the climate is mentioned in the overall holistic circular diagram that you always get in kind of documents. But, you know, I would really like to see the seriousness of the situation being a lot better underlined. You know, so I think, and Simon Khan, I just saw he's in our audience, and he's one of our design group reviewers, you know, in Southwest design panel, and he just said, do documents change behaviors?
Yeah.
I'm not sure they do. I think exemplars change behaviors, and I think people, you know, school kids out on the streets change behaviors. They raise awareness, and I think that there are easier ways to raise awareness than doing a very polite document like this one.
Yeah, I guess there is. I just want to refer back to our first poll result, which was about the kind of obstacles and barriers, and the general view was that it's mainly economic, and understanding how to influence the people you need to influence and then gearing your message to them is quite difficult, I suspect, when you are trying to write a guide that is, it even says in the National Design Guide introduction that it's basically for everyone. It's for local authorities, it's for elected members, it's for the developing industry. I've always been quite skeptical that you can actually do all that in one place. And I think messaging and tailoring the message to your very specific behavioral change that you want to achieve is the only way it's going to work. If anyone, sorry, Sarah, go on.
I was just going to say, but in terms of economic, I think it's also about the debate of risk and value and vision. They're really, really critical, and about the political that goes with that. And central government political roles, yes, it's important, but also local and regional political roles, just as important. And, you know, when it comes down to the local authority and for clients, etc., they're going to evaluate that risk. They're going to evaluate whether that has value, and that's value in terms of socially, environmentally, and economically.
Yeah.
But you need to really have a vision to really tie it together and push it. And if you don't have that vision, it just becomes piecemeal. So I think that's really important. And you can see some of the best schemes are the ones which really do have a vision that push it. I mean, that's what makes the change.
Right. So it's got to be driven at that level within. So who does that fall on, though? Is that the promoters and design teams rather than the policy backdrop? But that seems to me that if you get the right people in at the right place, you're going to get this, irrespective of what documents are living in the background. If someone wants to go away and do this, they can do that. They're in a great position to do that.
I think it's having a discussion that's evidence-led. You know,
right.
There's so much evidence now about the value of green spaces, about the value that cycle networks and foot networks have now. And I think that you have to emphasize and demonstrate that value. And you have to demonstrate it for your different audience. So if their main value is about economic, of which a high proportion is, you have to talk in those terms and demonstrate that. But you can demonstrate that now with so much research.
I think that's really important. That is the way, it's the bottom line thinking. That's the way to get to the house builders, certainly, I think. I mean, it's very interesting, you know, who is going to have the biggest influence within the overall built environment professionals, because I helped start up a thing called Architects Declare a year ago, and we now have 940 members, architectural practice, signed up to a declaration to kind of change our behavior in the way we look at built environment and create the built environment. And it's now got 5,000 signatures worldwide, you know. Now it is only a declaration, and people say, well, it's just hubris, it's just people kind of grandstanding, etc., and they're still building airports. But, you know, I think somehow getting together a group of people and actually saying, yes, we believe in this is really important. And interestingly, we've now got Landscape Architects Declare, we've got Architectural Educators Declare, we've got the Property Declares, and that's the really critical one, because that is the top property developers in London who have all signed up to a declaration which is even much more stringent than the architects one, which is really interesting. But the people who haven't actually put their name forward in that respect are the volume house builders. And I think that's where you're right, Sarah, that actually we have to get to them in a different way. It's the bottom line thinking. It's the real value that you add to houses by planting trees, by creating greenways, by creating biodiversity, and, you know, and the things that appeal to people, but also can be said to have a bottom line value on the price of your house.
On that point, I mean, is it a valid concern? Does this stuff blow viability out the water if you start to take this seriously, or is it just one of those kind of folklorish things where people just assume that if you want to make a place that is more climate sensitive, you're gonna pay through the nose?
I don't think so personally. I think that what's changing is who comes on early and how viability is assessed. Because
Okay.
I think in the past, I absolutely hate schlars. These are my pet hate.
Yeah. You've got a captive audience here to rant, so have at it.
Because what it's laid is like this idea that you have, okay, we've got a piece of land and this is how many houses you deliver. And I know that one local authority, they did it, and were told that they were going to deliver 1,200. Then they had a landscape capacity and sensitivity study, and the area was actually more like 300. Yet the projection they put in and fed to central government, 1,200, what actually went in for planning was 650. So you see this disparity occurring of who's actually that early stage. And I think one thing I just want to shift a little bit to was just touch upon about the biodiversity net gain in that. I know that it's been raised a little bit in some questions, not this one, but previous that have been raised. And that is going to change the emphasis somewhat more, because you have to start thinking about those early stage interventions and what you lead and develop as a developable area within a plot. So I think the viability aspect is changing. I wouldn't say it's rapidly changing. And everything's still sort of site allocation led and local plans, which is a bit farcical in some areas, but yeah.
Just before we carry on this point, we just had our second poll result on who has the most influence. And I mean, it seems to be that there's no middle ground. You have to lead, according to the audience anyway, we have to have the strong leadership at the top, and then we as individuals have our responsibility. I mean, is that a realistic thing to ask of people, I guess?
Well, I think it is. And I think the big thing is just how do you actually get all of us acting together, raising awareness and having the kind of communal synergy to get answers to climate change is really, really important. But it is, to me, that's really interesting that people are still reliant on central government, because I mean, Sarah, you were talking about Bristol and the local government initiatives, and I've always kind of thought, well, actually the bright local authorities, the far-seeing local authorities are doing a better job than central government at the moment. But on the other hand, we're now in a situation, let's get round to it, sort of post-COVID, real potential recession, well, it's actual recession. How are we going to build our way out of that? How are we going to deal with that? And quite a lot of people from different directions are saying, okay, this is the chance to deal with the huge problem that we have with the existing housing stock, the existing building stock, which we really need to tackle if we're going to have any chance of meeting our climate change commitments. And the idea of a Green New Deal is coming up from both political sides of the spectrum. And actually, it's a no-brainer when you kind of think, well, how do we save energy really dramatically over the next 10 years? We look at our existing building stock. How do we do that? It has to be incentivized. It has to be free insulation. It has to be looking at getting a new Green Deal going that looks at public buildings, public sector housing to start with, and then moves out across the board. So I think that would be a really interesting series of incentives if that was going to emerge in the post-COVID world.
Yeah,
I think there's a bigger issue perhaps to talk around everybody acting together, because of course carbon emissions arise from our demand for energy, and our demand for energy is largely about economic activity. And it's really telling, isn't it, to look globally now at the reductions in energy use that have come about simply from the collapse in economic activity due to COVID-19 lockdowns. The real issue surely is not to try and pin labels on individual sectors of the construction industry or individual sectors of society, such as the volume house builders, but to really think about how do we as a society maintain a level of economic activity that we are happy with, and what is the budget of energy and perhaps even carbon that we are prepared to spend to maintain that level of activity. And I do worry that we try and pin labels on individual sectors who are apparently not doing as well as other sectors, when it's about the entire economy changing and changing radically. And I noticed that a poll question has just popped up, which perhaps requires just a little bit of explanation. When we talk about zero carbon, we have problems of definition. In fact, the whole sustainability sector is riddled with miscomprehensions around definitions. When we talk about a zero carbon home, generally, people are only talking about the building regulations measured energy for heating and hot water and lighting and ventilation, if there is any. Yet when we talk about a zero carbon planet, we're actually talking about self-sufficiency. We have to be able to derive all of our energy needs, all of our primary energy needs, either from the sun or from gravity, which are the only two genuinely renewable energy sources that we have available. And at different scales between those two extremes, we may have to take different approaches. And a lot of those approaches are reliant on our being able to trade carbon offsets or ecology offsets or some other kind of offsets with people outside our immediate sphere. So if we're talking about genuine zero carbon, in other words, self-sufficiency, what level do we believe we can actually deliver this at? And therefore, at what level do we need to be working together and cooperating in order to deliver genuine zero carbon? Or
yeah, I'd just like to add to that as well, is that there's been such a fixation on zero carbon that everything else tends to get forgotten sometimes. And so you'd get, I'll give you an example, is mass plantations of trees to offset carbon, but have very little biodiversity value. What's the point?
or carbon value.
And that doesn't, they're all interlinked. Like
Absolutely.
you can't have a development that is carbon zero, but has little biodiversity value.
Yes. And we've got to be careful. I mean, carbon offsetting is a very, very contentious and controversial area. You know, nature does a very good job of growing without human interference. The fact that we assign people to plant trees to create carbon offsets perhaps doesn't recognize that human intervention makes very little difference on a planetary scale to the propagation and natural growth of nature. And so, you know, we've got to be careful about the whole premise of carbon offsetting, I believe.
I agree.
One thing sorry, Peter.
I'm sure Sarah would agree with that you know, the value of a tree is hugely more than the carbon it does offset. And, you know, we have to kind of think of our own health and well-being, and particularly, again, in this sort of COVID era and pandemic. And just I think the importance of planting trees is more realigning our relationship with nature, really, which I think has gone completely out the window over the last 20 years. Or you could say,
and I think what's interesting is that because of tree planting with cities is a real challenge. I mean, it is really complicated now because there are so many underground services, there's so many challenges of building lines, etc. But there's some research recently to show that you'd need a 40% tree canopy cover in an urban hard environment to make any difference with urban heat on an effect. Now, 40% tree canopy is pretty enormous, especially as at the moment in our only net in terms of carbon in the UK is deciduous broadleaf woodland, of which we only have 13% cover in the UK. Right. And only 10% in England. So, and that is in woodland areas. That's not even including the cities and towns, etc. So it's an interesting one in terms of debate about what we do, because there's an offset also in terms of how we cool buildings. If you've got a street tree that is placed next to a building, that building there will be cooler in the summer period if you have the right tree in the right place. And
sorry.
we need that interlinking between buildings and landscape needs to work so much better than it is now.
A thought that has occurred to me watching, this is something that we would probably get onto in more detail if we've got time, but everything that's been discussed so far has come back to the fact you need to make space for this stuff to happen, be it at the site allocation level, understanding that a good swathe of that site will need to be given over to supporting all these other agendas, not just, you can't just assume a housing coverage. And again, when you say about kind of tree cover in urbanized areas, if you want those large specimen trees, you need to have space for them. I'm wondering if there might be an opportunity, and I feel a bit kind of grubby talking about opportunities when lots of people are being very ill and dying, but it does seem to me that the way people are going to use existing spaces, that we have an opportunity to experiment with that right now, and some people are, in terms of increasing the amount of pedestrian cycle space within any allocated movement corridor, for example. And I do wonder, and it'd be interesting, the future of movement, the way that we curate our movement corridors, streets and spaces, does that present an opportunity to not only tackle the amount of energy we use to move and the type of energy we use to move, but also the way what we put into those spaces to make them more attractive, more carbon friendly, etc.
I think there's going to be a huge difference since people have experienced quietness in cities and lack of pollution. And if you do dare to go out, the extraordinary ability to wander in cities, not collide with people and cars and whatever. I think that is going to be a game changer. And I think that we need to pick up this in the post-COVID world, what people have learned over the last few weeks and months, and work with it within our planning system. And I do think, we have to give over more of our streets to people. It's now, I think, 15 years since the Manual for Streets was produced, and that's an extremely good document. But actually, it'd be really good to revisit that in relation to creating more space for people. And I think, I think we're going to see the changes that are happening in London at the moment, I think are going to be irreversible. And I think that's great. And I think that, the more that we can get people out of tin boxes and onto bicycle seats, the better.
I'd just like to add to that about noise pollution, because it's on a subject I know quite a bit about from the research I'm doing, and also what's coming out, funnily, from, I think it was the RMC or the AA came out, how drivers now are much more aware. They did a survey, aware of how much noise their car creates. So like, there's a lot of comparative data that's going on at the moment. And I think because noise is a very tangible thing, it's immediate, and air quality is too. But the interesting about noise is that there's now links between noise and birdsong being a well-being factor as well. And there's been a big global research at the moment about birdsong, etc. And you've got to start thinking, okay, if it's birdsong that people want to hear, and there is a real mental health and well-being, we've got to think about habitats. We've got to think about what we're going to integrate, the routes and spaces that not are just for people, but for wildlife. Because as you realise, if there's less people about and you have that diverse habitat, then nature will thrive. There needs to be a balance between the two, and that's not there yet. And it's going to be tricky, but I think people, because they're more aware, hopefully that starts the conversation more. Yeah.
I want to carry on this because it's really interesting. But first, we've had the result back on our latest poll. Doug, pretty much everyone thinks that you can do this at the dwelling level.
Yeah. It's interesting, that, isn't it? If we look back, 2008, Professor David Mackay, who went on to become one of the government scientific advisors, wrote a book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And he undertook a review of all the primary energy demands in the UK and came to the conclusion, he also did a review of all the available renewable energy resources within the UK landmass and our sovereign sea areas. And he came to the conclusion that with a 40% reduction in primary energy demand, which basically means we take on board zero carbon construction for all new buildings and zero carbon retrofits for all existing buildings. And we reduce commuting and personal transport use by a significant percentage. And we reduce a number of other areas of economic activity to achieve an overall 40% reduction in UK primary energy demand, that we'd still then only be able to produce 80% of our demand from indigenous renewable energy sources, and we would require 20% imports from somewhere else. So if we're talking about, I think we need to be clear about what we're really genuinely talking about when we're talking about zero carbon, because we are talking about no fossil fuel use. We're not talking about generating a surplus of solar energy on your roof during the summer and then running an electric heat pump using an oil-fired power station in the winter. This level of genuine zero carbon requires actually international cooperation in order to deliver. And I think that's something that we ought to take into account, rather than persisting in a belief that perhaps we can we can't act necessarily as individuals, whether that's an individual or whether it's an individual city or whether it's an individual region. We need to be thinking, I believe, much bigger in our overall development planning terms, and promoting cooperation across much wider groups in the economy and internationally.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Peter. You wanted to jump in.
Well, I agree, and I think if you look at primary energy use in the UK, there's something like 31% in transport as opposed to 20%, 15% in housing, and 20% in other buildings. So the transport sector is the one, as we know from the 17% reduction in global emissions in the last 2 months.
Seen that figure, yeah.
It is huge, and that is primarily reduction in transport use. And, it's made a huge. We've been looking at our own carbon footprint as a practice.
Yep.
And it's gone down dramatically because of lack of rail travel as well as
But what's really interesting is the way that transport is changing in response to other economic drivers. In the last decade, transportation in general, and transportation energy use has increased more or less in line with increases in GDP, around about 6 to 8% per decade. But what's really interesting is that private car use within that figure has only increased by around about 4%. But white van deliveries for home delivery, for online economy, has increased by 38%.
Yeah.
And so, all these things are connected in a way with the way that we live our lives and the way that we're going to have to relearn to live in different ways. The impact of lockdown and the online economy could have other consequences that we haven't foreseen yet.
Okay, so, sorry, you wanted to come in on that. Can I just quickly share this poll result here? So has your experience of COVID-19 changed your professional decision making? Reinforce and strengthen. Okay, interesting. So this has really brought this whole scenario seems to have really brought this kind of thing to the fore. Maybe not too surprising, but yeah, it's interesting nonetheless. Sarah, go on.
If I was just going to add was, I think in my mind, from my experience, maybe I think there needs to be a change in the way that local planning on the broader local plan scale, regional and national scale changes, because at the moment it's back to this whole thing of site allocation, when really we need to start thinking about infrastructure planning. And that needs to be not just about green infrastructure, which is to do with cycleways and network corridors. We also got to think about services and service infrastructure on that scale, because where you put a district heating line in will affect what goes above. So if you're going to put in a district heating line and blah, 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 I know from experience, they are massive pipes. They take a very large amount of space to turn a corner, and that wipes out any tree planting above. So this is where I think the infrastructure, wouldn't it be great if that before the plan, you basically lead by the landscape authority sort of side, but also there's guidance from national government, and there needs to be a bridging between the two, but for that infrastructure-led approach, rather than just call out for sites. I just think that the call out for sites is such a problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of seems to weirdly kind of fly in the face of the way we have been, I think, pushed as a wider industry to develop our to do development. We've been pushed away from the kind of joined up thinking that works across regions. And there's some comments scrolling in the chat here about are we talking about kind of wide scale strategies? And Doug, your point that you really, if you want to take this stuff seriously, you've got to do it at scale and understand the interrelationships between what you're doing and what other people are doing. And that I think the National Design Guide, to loop back to what we're talking about, does seem to place quite a lot of emphasis on what you do, either at the plot level, maybe slightly beyond the plot level, kind of to the red line level. And we maybe we're asking the question in the wrong place. I'm not saying there's nothing that can be done there, but it does seem to me that you're not going to get the big step changes that we have identified are needed at that level. You can't just stick a bit of eco bling on a building or go fabric first or whatever, and then just say job done.
I think it's really interesting from speaking from a perspective of a design review panelist. You know, I've chaired the design review panel in Southwest now for 15 years or whatever. And the earlier that we get in to look at particularly large scale schemes, I think the more useful we are. And one of the things that we do with new community developments in the design review panel is that all our disciplines, you know, from landscape, infrastructure, engineering, sustainability, architecture, and urban design, are generally all represented there. So you do have that kind of lively discussion at an early stage to raise all the issues. And I think that the only way we're going to move towards a sustainable future is actually if we do look at things holistically. And I think that's generally that works best. Going back to what the previous question was, generally it works better the larger the scale. I mean, I agree with the response to the question in that if you want me to design a zero energy house, I could probably do that, but it is not going to be relevant to the future of society. What's relevant to the future of society is doing really kind of low carbon community developments. And that's where you can make a huge difference, largely because of transportation and infrastructure and biodiversity.
And I've just touched on, there was a question here about local neighbourhood plans, which I think was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So it's just a question about, you know, those sort of challenges. And I've worked on a couple of neighbourhood plans, parish green infrastructure strategies as technical guides that specifically linking these particular elements about, and let's not forget about health and well-being in this discussion, because a low carbon development should be and is a healthy development. So they are directly interlinked. So if you know, active travel is all the determinants in terms of a healthy development is a major component, as is sports and recreation. Obviously, food and access to food is another thing as well, so let's not forget about that. But the fact is that you do have these interlinkings, and local development plans are quite an interesting process they're going through at the moment, because I think they're seeing this as kind of like, well, hang on a minute, we can do things on a more local parish, town council scale. It doesn't all have to rely on national government.
Yeah, I mean, the body, there is a reasonably robust body of research that suggests the interdependency of the greenness, effectively, of your transport options in terms of your experience of moving through them. Are you close to planting? Are you close to trees, and so on? And your willingness to use them. And people will. This is, I wish I could remember this off the top of my head. There was a kind of hierarchy of how people would choose to move, and that the second one down, I think the first one was directness, but the second one was essentially quality or route quality. And when people described what they liked to move through, they were talking about kind of trees, near green space, near kind of, you know, good quietness, you know, that kind of thing. So obviously with the other bits about overlooking and feeling safe, but so yeah, it seems to be this interdependency of agendas is a very positive thing, because you can do one action that gets you kind of scores well across a number of different areas.
Multifunctional. It's got to.
Yeah.
Land is
Yeah.
such a, it's a high commodity. So maximize the use of it. It really needs to be skill design that is multifunctional in its use, but also how it relates to that building and how the building relates to it in a beneficial way that helps with climate change. They can't be separated. It's all part of it. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously that's quite complex depending on procurement and depending on the process. And let's not forget, it's not just about planning, it's what happens after planning, what happens in construction, and more importantly, what happens during maintenance, of which there's normally nothing sometimes.
Can I just come back to that? That reminds me of my initial statement, which is that for us as architects, everything's changed, because actually 10, 15 years ago, you'd have thought our biggest challenge was reducing the energy used in our buildings. Now, because of decarbonisation of the grid and improvements in technology and everything, the biggest challenge is just not putting the energy into the building in the first place. So what we call embodied energy, the energy that goes into concrete and bricks and all those kind of things, is really, really significant, as is the energy to maintain the buildings that Sarah's talking about. So if you take that over say a 50-year life of a building, it's much bigger than the proportion of the energy that goes into running the building. And I think that's gonna, people haven't kind of cottoned on to that yet. The act of building is an act which uses huge amounts of carbon. Yep. And we have to really think how low carbon materials are the future.
With a certain caveat, I think, Peter, because actually what's really needed is proper evidence-based analysis at the design stage to discover which combination of embodied carbon and operational carbon gives you the lowest lifetime outcome. Yes, it's absolutely true that operational carbon over the lifetime of a building used to represent about 80% and embodied around about 20%. And with improvements both in energy efficiency and reduction of grid carbon, that's come down. The operational side has come down a lot. So when you make that comparison again now, it's more like 50-50. And the overall, sorry?
Or even 70-30.
Yeah. And the over, well, I'm talking about the average construction, perhaps not the exemplars. And the overall lifetime carbon has come down to around about 50-60% of what we would have achieved in previous decades. As we move forwards, further grid carbon reduction becomes increasingly difficult because of the dispatchable nature of renewables, the non-dispatchable nature of renewables and the cyclical demands from buildings not matching up. And increasing the energy efficiency of the buildings themselves becomes increasingly difficult. So I think we're entering a time when there is a trade-off to be had between expenditure of carbon in the construction materials and opportunities for further carbon reduction at the operational stage, either through energy efficiency or through enabling the infrastructure to achieve higher renewable penetration. And what we really need is a decent evidence base that says these strategies might work in these sort of scenarios. But even then, it's going to, we're very much into a scenario when we need to analyze development proposals on a case-by-case basis in order to discover what works best, given socioeconomic drivers, given context, given climate drivers.
But one of the things that we would definitely agree on, I think, Doug, is that actually it's much better to refurbish existing buildings and use.
Of course, absolutely. If you think of all the carbon embodied in our existing building fabric, which we can either conserve or we can wipe away and spend all over again, it makes absolute nonsense of a suggestion that we wipe away existing buildings to replace them with highly efficient modern replacements.
And that's a really interesting point, because there's been some research recently by, I can't remember who it is, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but they about that same thing for landscape. in the fact that can you have a development where essentially, particularly concentrating on brownfields and areas of extensive hard landscape, where you don't export anything and you don't import anything in terms of growing materials. And it's been super interesting because they've now found that, you know, you can have these really quite amazing mosaic of habitats and landscapes that are from essentially just waste products. And it's about this evidence side that you're talking about there. I think it's really critical because there's now really interesting evidence coming out, like, for example, multi-story of different types of planting actually helps absorb more carbon. Well, obviously, because you have that multi-story plantings that are, you know, going to absorb more, but it's that evidence behind it that enables you to go, right, okay, so we can pursue something like that. So I think that there are changes happening, but I think this is where that is almost where the importance of what you specify and the detailed design side and how that is managed is critical, because it's no point setting aside these things if you don't have that in place.
All right. I'm just conscious of time. I'm conscious that we've got some lively discussion happening in the chat window that I'm trying to read as this goes, and you know, I can't even single task, let alone multitask. We do have some questions in the Q&A. This would go, I think, a bit back to the point that we're talking about now about evidence base and how best present this and make the kind of quantifiable decision making. Peter, you were talking about documents, other documents that you use. Can you name them quickly? Is that okay? Just so that, sorry to put you on the spot.
In the questions as well, you know, what are the other, if this one doesn't fit the bill, what does?
Yeah.
What we use an awful lot, that's only a few months old really, is the London, it's the Letty Guide. I'll hold it up here. Here's London Energy Transformation Initiative. And it's actually it's a fantastic document that gives you a very easy step-by-step guide towards producing low energy design. You're talking about small scale housing, larger scale housing, commercial buildings, schools, etc. And there's a companion guide which looks at embodied energy in buildings as well. They're both available free online. Letty, the group that produced them is about sort of 30 or 40 young engineers, generally young engineers and architects working initially for London. It was initially for the TfO, I think, sponsored it originally. And it's just now beginning to take off. The London boroughs are using it and local authorities around the country are now recognizing that it's a really useful document to kind of think about when you're looking at low carbon design.
Okay,
that's
fantastic.
one. The other is, of course, the RIBA 2030 guide, which is actually just tells you how to produce buildings that move towards a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030.
Okay. We got another one in the Q&A is about exemplars. Sorry, go on, Sarah. Did you have something else to add to that?
Say was that there's a couple of others just to bear in mind, and that is obviously with biodiversity net gain coming through as legislation, but there is a standard that's coming out now that's before the legislation, so that's in draft form. I think the consultation for it finished a couple of days ago. So that's going to be a significant driver of how development is in terms of the process, etc., and what's considered. And there's also a couple of others, and that is Building for Life, and also Building with Nature assessment as well, because that's more to do with green infrastructure and landscape, and that obviously is interlinked with low carbon. So.
Okay, fantastic. We've got another question here about exemplars. And there's the kind of the idea of, you know, like carbuncle cup, that kind of thing. Interesting Twitter handle there if people want to follow it. I do actually follow that one. It's highly amusing. We've been asked not to swear because we're recording this, and I must admit it's been very painful for me not to. But does anyone want to answer that question? Is there a good place to go to see this stuff in action? And I do actually think these exemplars are generally very powerful in terms of, especially if you can show back to large developers where they have done very, very well in the past. You can say, do you know what, you've got this in you because you've done it here. You've done it here. Why aren't you doing it on our site, for example? Has anyone got any kind of, is there a repository of kind of stuff that people can view?
Yeah, on the Landscape Institute website, there's loads of case studies of green development, retrofit as well as new builds. I mean, there's a few highlighted in the National Design Guide, and one of them was the Greater Green project in Sheffield. That's quite an interesting as a retrofit. But as a new build for housing, there's quite a lot on the LI website that you can go through. And also the Building of Nature has lots of case studies too.
Okay. An example of housing, you know, local. Just look at the last year Sterling Prize winner, you know, best building in the country, and the Carl Riches Goldsmith Road in Norwich. You know, it's a fantastic little scheme of housing that is designed to passive house standards, timber frame, really low embodied energy. Or look at 2 or 3 years ago at Steve Tompkins' refurbishment of the theatre, Everyman Theatre in Liverpool, which did the same thing for refurbishment. So there are the exemplars there.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left. We've got 2 more questions I want to get through. So this one from Claire about how do we get local plans, housing targets developed, etc. Focus more on reusing buildings and adapting them. I mean, can we incentivize that? I suppose the next question is, are we building the right buildings that can be reused and can be adapted? Or is there too much focus on the single-use design? Does anyone want to comment
focus
on
on
that?
Single-use design, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incentivization. I mean, we've been trying to run a campaign to remove VAT from refurbishment, certainly on deep green refurbishment. You know, that would be an incredibly good incentive to deal with the existing building stock. Yep. Some people should go on. It should put the VAT on new building rather than on refurbishment.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's there's incentivization to happen there, definitely. You know, other issues. I mean, I think that we, you know, in terms of local plans, just going back to there is a role for national government, there is a role for local government, and local governments, I think, should be taking the lead over national government at the moment, because MHCLG, you know, they're going through a kind of a revisiting of building regulations, and I think they're going to reduce the standards. You know, that's what was happening until there was a huge furore around that about 3 or 4 months ago, and they now put it on hold. But I think that, you know, the key thing is getting local governments to do that, and local authorities to act in a more kind of advanced way than central government, and to lead the way. That's what's happening throughout the states as well. You know, it's kind of an interesting dilemma. Where does the real power lie?
I am conscious that we are out of time. We have used up our allotted hour. We're going to be circulating feedback from this. We're going to be making all the questions available, that kind of thing. All this chat discussion that's been going on, I believe, is savable. We do have one more poll we'd like you to take part in before you sign out. I think we could carry on for ages. So hopefully most of you agree that would be a good thing. Unfortunately, we've got to go, but I want to thank you all for attending, and I want to thank the panel in particular for making our first webinar lively, interesting, exciting, no swearing, but yeah, hopefully everyone's found it useful. Attendees, if you're all still here, you'll be getting feedback and from this, and you'll be able to influence what we're talking about at the next one. And our next one's on the 16th, and we're talking about character in that one. It's always a very difficult subject to cover. I'm kind of looking forward to that. I'm sure that'll be controversial as well. But suffice to say, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you for your contribution, panel.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.